All right, so without further ado, let's go to the first session. We have two speakers for this session, both from Microsoft Canada. Let me do a quick introduction. We have Kirsten Turnbull, technical specialist, security and compliance from Microsoft Canada. Kirsten has more than 20 years experience in network security, covering both IT and OT networks. Having spent lots of time in the oil and gas, manufacturing, utility, pharmaceutical, mining, and startup industries, provided Kirsten the ability to truly understand the needs of each specific industry, and more importantly, the risk they are facing. And we also have Jharana Luitel, Associate Technical Specialist from Microsoft. Jharana holds a degree in computer science with a minor in business administration from the University of New Brunswick. She is a dedicated professional and with a passion for using technology to solve complex solutions. All right, so I will stop my sharing. And as you can see, their topic was about how to unite OT and IT for smarter and more secure future.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Brian, for such a good introduction. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jharana Luitel, and I am an associate technical specialist for the cybersecurity team at Microsoft. I, along with Kirsten, who is the senior technical specialist, will be presenting a high-level overview of the differences between OT and IT environment and how we can approach them from a security standpoint. As our world becomes more increasingly digital, it's really important to understand the distinction between operational technology and information technology system. So yeah, sit back, relax, and let's dive into this exciting topic. So I'm going to go over the agenda quickly. So today we'll talk about a bit about OT and IoT, and then move on to what a Purdue model is, and then we'll look into some IoT attack and OT attack, and then move on to sys controls and look into some industrial challenges that the CISO and the customers are facing currently, and how we can protect the enterprise. And at the end, we're just going to have like a quick summary about all the things that we went through. So yeah, now talking about IoT, what exactly is IoT? IoT stands for Internet of Things. In simple words, it's like a giant virtual playground where all your devices are like best friends and they play together to make your life more easier. It's like a team of superheroes with each device having its own unique power. For example, your smartwatch tracks your fitness goals. Your voice assistant orders groceries, and your smart thermostat keeps your home at a perfect temperature. They all work together, communicating and sharing information to make your day-to-day task effortless and more enjoyable. So just like how a good friend knows your likes and dislikes, IoT devices learn from your habits and preferences to give a more personalized experiences that's more tailored just for you. So in more technical term, it refers to a network of physical objects, devices, and sensors that are embedded with internet connectivity, allowing them to collect and exchange data with other devices and systems. The main goal of IoT is to enable these devices to communicate with each other and with humans, making it possible to collect and analyze data and automate various processes. This can lead to increased efficiency, better decision making, and also improved quality of life. So moving on to OT. So what exactly is operational technology? So OT refers to the hardware and software system that controls and monitors physical processes such as manufacturing, transportation, and energy production. These systems are designed to be highly reliable and often have a real-time requirements, meaning they need to respond quickly to changes in the physical environment. They also tend to have a longer lifespan than other IT systems, sometimes even lasting for decades. So in simple terms, OT is like a traffic controller, keeping the flow of cars moving smoothly and safely. It's like a superhero, like the way I mentioned for IoT, with the power to keep your power plants, water treatment plants, and other critical infrastructure running without a hitch. Some examples of OT system include industrial control system, supervisory control and data acquisition system, and programmable logic controllers. Without OT, our daily lives would be so much more chaotic and definitely unpredictable. So yeah, as we know, the world is going IoT and OT, and it is going like that because it has the potential to revolutionize the way we live, work, and interact with the environment. According to a report by Gartner, there were over 20 billion connected IoT devices in use just in 2020, and this number is expected to rise to over 50 billion by 2030. In fact, 75% of enterprises already have over 5,000 IoT devices in use. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic also really accelerated the adoption of IoT and OT as a lot of companies decided to move more remotely. And IoT and OT has the potential to improve efficiency, productivity, and decision making in a wide range of domains from healthcare and transportation to manufacturing and even in the energy industry. So yeah, aligning IT and OT is very critical for the operational success in today's connected world. While IT and OT have been traditionally viewed as like a separate entities within an organization, the lines between them are becoming increasingly blurred as more devices and systems are becoming more interconnected. The organizational alignment between IT and OT is very crucial for ensuring the efficient and effective integration of these technologies. Different groups need to work together in order to provide successful integration and more visibility with a focus on sharing data and insights to achieve more common goals. This requires not only technical expertise, but also an understanding of the political boundaries and cultural differences between IT and OT teams. Ultimately, the alignment of IT and OT is very, very crucial for organizations to fully leverage the potential of IT and OT and drive innovation and growth in a rapidly evolving technology landscape. As we can see how aligning IT and OT is really important. So let's talk a bit about the Purdue model. So what exactly is the Purdue model? So it is a reference model for industrial control system that provides a structured framework for the design and implementation of secure and reliable networks in OT and IT environment. The model enables organizations to implement a defense in depth approach to cybersecurity by using multiple layers of security controls at each level. A quick fun fact, the model is named after Purdue University, where it was first introduced in the 1990s. And the model consists of multiple levels or zones, each of which represents a different level of security and control. At the lowest level are the field control devices, such as sensors, which are connected to controllers or PLCs. The next level is the process control level, where the PLCs or the controllers are connected to supervisory control and data acquisition system. The supervisory level is above that, which oversees multiple control systems, and the industrial and enterprise level is at the top. Now, I'll pass it on to Kristen, who is gonna talk in depth about the Purdue model.
Thanks so much, Jharana. So let's take apart the Purdue model a little bit and kind of look at what types of devices live where in the Purdue model. And you can see down at the lowest level, we have level 0 with field control level. This is where we see sensors and actuators. Typically, the communications in this level are serial communications, so we're not on Ethernet at this point. Very physical in nature. You can see the bridge though, where at level 1 they start to integrate with the PLCs and the RTUs. And the PLC stands for Programmable Logic Controller, and the RTU stands for Remote Terminal Unit. These are typically always found at level 1, at least in my travels. There has been a couple times where they're not quite in alignment where they should be, but there's a specific reason that we follow the Purdue model, and it has to do with segmentation. To be honest, everybody hears about zero trust these days, but you heard Jharana mention that this was developed in the 90s. This really is taking zero trust considerations and assuming breach, really segmenting these networks from being able to communicate or allow communications to transmit downwards. So when we're looking at the engineering station and the HMI, these are typically workstations or servers or desktops that are used to work on the PLCs and the RTUs. And when I say work, I just mean, input programs, do maintenance, there's firmware upgrades and all that. So this, in my opinion, the level 1 and level 2 portion of the network is probably contains the most valuable information. For me, I find, that a lot of the traffic inside of these networks are operating specific OT protocols. There's also a beautiful thing about these networks is they're really boring, but boring in probably the best possible way. And I say that because when we look to secure these types of networks, there's a bit of a challenge. And the challenge is basically you can't really insert a single packet onto this network. So your job is to secure the network, but you're actually not allowed to even be on the network. So how do we go about doing that? That's a really challenging concept when you're coming from IT and you have 4,000 different types of scanning tools that you use on a daily basis. So those tools are not allowed here. And really, you can't even say the 4-letter S word, which is scan, when you're around these types of environments. And the reason for that is the PLCs are basically programmed to understand specific protocols. And I've been in networks before where somebody used an angry IP scanning tool where it's just ICMP, just simple ICMP. Well, guess what the PLC in this environment didn't like? It didn't like ICMP. It completely rendered the PLC unoperational. So we can't use our traditional tool sets in this area of the network. So it's really critical that when we're looking to get information that we do so in a passive way. So we're not interrogating devices on the network. We're literally listening to a span port off of a network switch. And a span port really is just a copy of the traffic that's in that environment. The value here is the data that I was talking about that exists in level 1 and level 2 is highly valuable from an asset inventory perspective, from an operational processes perspective. So in the traffic, you'll get really interesting stuff such as what firmware the PLCs are running, what cards are plugged into the slots on the PLC, what is the vendor of the PLC, what's the IP address. All of the asset details are contained inside of this network. They don't traverse the network either. Think of this as being very east-west. It's not leaving the network. You're not really going to get this great asset detail unless you're sniffing the network down at this level. And as you can see, as we go further up the stack, we can see where the historian and the domain controllers kind of exist in the industrial DMZ. And again, to reiterate, when the traffic is being passed through these networks, it's going up. And under no circumstance can you skip a level. You can't go from level 1 to level 3. You can't go from level 2 to level 4. And you certainly cannot go down in these environments. So the way that they're segmented is basically to push data up. And they present to us challenging opportunities when it comes to securing. But we're going to talk about Defender for IoT that we use at Microsoft. And you see the gray box there in the center of the diagram. It's really what we're using to collect the metadata about the devices in this environment. And you'll see a little bit further, I'll have some screenshots where we can take a look at that. Thanks, Jharana.
Yeah, so as thanks Kirsten for talking in detail about the Purdue model. So with the rise of interconnected devices and systems, there is a need for enhanced security measures to protect against the cyber attacks and data breaches. According to a report by Forescout, IoT and OT attacks increased by 2.6 times in the last 3 years, and these attacks can have very serious consequences, including disruption of critical infrastructure, data theft, and even physical harm to an individual. Some of the attacks include NASA hacked because of an unauthorized Raspberry Pi connected to its network, or hackers are attacking a smart building access system. So as such, ensuring the security of IoT and OT system is very crucial for the widespread adoption and success. And talking about some attacks, let's look into one example of an IoT attack that happened and one example of OT attack. This is a really interesting attack. So in 2018, HackRaid reported on a case where hackers gained access to a casino's network through a smart thermometer in a fish tank located in the casino lobby. The thermometer was connected to the internet and had weak security measures in place, which the hackers exploited to gain access to the casino's network. Once inside, they were able to access the sensitive data, including customers' information and high roller list. Once the attacker obtained the database, they were able to exfiltrate it out of the network through the thermometer by passing the casino security controls. This incident served as a warning to the companies to be more vigilant about the security of their IoT devices and also to take steps to ensure that they are adequately protected. So the lesson here was to secure your laptop, secure your smartphone, secure your tablet, and before I forget, secure your fish tank as well. So yeah, this was one of the examples of IoT attack. Now moving on to the OT attack. So it's the Triton or Trisis attack. So what is this hack? So in the fall of 2017, malicious software was detected in petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia, and it was discovered to be able to take over what you call a safety instrument or a safety system. It was pretty much targeted towards, and then the product was called Triconix. So basically, there was a malware found with an industrial environment. The Triton malware, which is an example of an OT attack, which specifically targets CIS and designed to manipulate safety system. So when we think of CIS and OT cybersecurity, we can think of this type of system, and probably the best way I personally would describe this flavor of cybersecurity is cyber physical joint. For instance, an individual might press a button on a keypad or something like that, and that might have caused some kind of a physical action that happens in the real world. So why was this hacking attack's history so important to mention here? So typically, when we think about hacking, we usually think about a phishing email, like hacking a social security number or getting personal data or information. But we usually don't think of things that can affect the life of an individual. So the reason why this hack was so important was targeting safety instrument equipment, specifically represents a more dangerous within computer network attack. The potential impact include not only equipment damage, but also potentially loss of life. In 2018, FireEye detected a new Triton framework that they believed is consistent with the nation state preparing for an attack. This just goes to show that the threat of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure is very real. And there are like lots of lessons to be learned from this Trisis incident. For example, credential harvesting and poor network segmentation, which allowed the malware to move laterally and infect internet-connected system. It's crucial that companies that rely on industrial control system take steps to protect their system from malware attacks like this. This means implementing more robust security measures, regularly updating the system, and prioritizing more cybersecurity efforts to prevent potentially more catastrophic consequences. So yeah, now I'll pass it on to Kirsten, who is going to talk about the CIS controls.
Thanks, Jharana. Anytime I hear about Triton or I have to talk about Triton, I feel a little bit uneasy because, you know, it doesn't really get more real than that. When you realize the intent of what the malware was going to do, it really hits home how important it is that we really take cybersecurity seriously in these environments. So with that being said, you know, let's talk about the CIS controls. These are a set of controls that up until today when I did the screenshot, I thought there was 20, but it looks like they've amalgamated a couple of them. So we have 18 controls, and these controls are just a framework to use when looking at securing devices in our environment, securing networks. I want to really just focus on the first control, because the first control is inventory and control of enterprise assets. And for some reason, this seems to be probably the most challenging control. And oftentimes it gets skipped. Now, when we skip this step, as you look below, you can see that there's a whole bunch of different security actions that we can do. So like malware defenses, you know, application software security, incident response management, penetration testing. If you don't get number one as accurate as possible, basically everything that you're trying to implement in your environment is geared towards a smaller footprint of assets. And so this is why I think, you know, I will shout it from the hilltops. I've been saying it for 20 years. I'll say it to the end of my career. Visibility is really important, especially when it comes to intrusion detection and incident response. We want to be able to understand what assets are in our environment. We want to be able to understand how they work. We want to be able to understand what software and firmware is running on those assets, and are there any vulnerabilities associated with those assets. But I can't stress enough how important the number one control is here, the first control. And the more effort that you put into number 1, the better 2 to 18 is going to look for your environment. So thanks, Jharana. You can go to the next slide. With that being said, we're going to kind of take a look at the different types of OT/IoT devices. And I really want to highlight how we treat them differently because, you heard me earlier talking about OT. We don't put packets on the network. It's really a passive way of looking at what's happening in that network. But then, on your corporate IoT network, you got coffee makers. You're allowed to scan those. So we have to kind of break it up to really understand, what's agentless, what's a micro agent. So at the top of the slide, you'll see that there's a security threat intelligence that kind of is broad across the page. And the threat intelligence really is trying to portray that, for all of these devices in your environment, you're going to need specific threat intel to be able to detect attacks on these devices. So the threat intelligence that you're going to use in OT and ICS is going to look a lot different than the threat intelligence that you're going to use in a corporate IoT environment. That being said, it's important to have it across the board that we're applying threat intelligence to all of the areas in the network so that we're able to detect the types of attacks that are geared towards the devices in the environment. So we can see on the very left, we have the green field, the security micro agent. This is really just a lightweight agent that sits on the sensor. It uses like very minimal CPU. It gathers information about the sensor itself and the system. It'll forward it up to our Azure IoT hub, and that's where we perform any type of security analysis on that data. Then we get into OT. So I talked about that a little bit earlier. We have PLCs, we have relays, we have RTUs, we have industrial automation technologies, embedded proprietary protocols. This alone itself requires a different way of approaching security, which I talked about. And again, in these networks, if you're familiar with the IT, CIA triad, the OT has an extra triangle or an extra point, I guess. So I guess it's a square. But safety and availability are the #1 critical components. So when we address anything in OT, we have to keep in mind that safety and availability are first and foremost. Then we move to the enterprise, where it's more like the Wild West, right? You can scan in here. Typically, the IoT devices in your corporate environment are going to be everywhere. So there's always best practices when it comes to trying to secure them. And again, I'll say it, visibility, have them segmented off, understand what they do. So baseline their behavior, understand, what access they need to the internet. Obviously, they're going to need to get updates from somewhere, but understanding what these IoT devices are doing in the environment is critical. In OT, we're able to, you heard me say earlier that they're beautifully boring, but what that presents to us is the ability to do anomaly detection. So when you have a network that doesn't have any dynamic nature at all, really the devices are doing the same process at the same time for the same duration. Process cycles vary. If you're in mining, the cycle's going to look a lot different than if you're in, say, manufacturing like a bakery. Oil and gas is very different. They all have different process cycles, but what's to note is that when you can understand the full process cycle, anything that's different from what you've seen in that time period becomes an alert. So if a new node pops up in your network that wasn't there before, that's an alert. So that's going to tell you, hey, there's something in the network. New protocols introduced. A lot of times we see, third-party contractors coming in. This is where it's really valuable. You can actually see what actions they're taking in the network, and being able to alert on deviations is the greatest way to catch attackers in the reconnaissance phase. You can go to the next slide, Jharana. Here we got, I'm not going to be able to go through this whole slide. In fact, we're running out of time here, but we have just basically kind of IoT and ICS security maturity model. So let's start at the very top left, where a lot of the places that I have traveled to, this is kind of where they're at, where all of their assets are documented in a spreadsheet. The static network map is really just a Visio diagram that was printed out like 10 years ago and has a bunch of coffee stains on it. And it's usually on a table somewhere in the environment. So that's kind of that's where we're starting at level 1. But when you look over at level 4, from an asset management perspective, you can see now you've got integration with your asset inventory database. Your CMD is much more populated than it was before. You have a greater idea of the assets in your environment, the software, the firmware that's running on them, all of the attributes to do with that asset. So you're looking at going from having this manual task of doing a spreadsheet to wow, we've got a real-time live CMDB showing all of our assets. And then we look down kind of at the enablement of IT. Oh, we can might as well skip, Jharana, because I am running out of time. Incident management gaps in modern SOC. So we do have gaps, that's absolutely for sure. So people, there's a lack of OT expertise and knowledge within current SOC teams. This is absolutely true. I find when you're on the OT side, it's not hard to talk technically to OT folks, but when you talk to IT folks about programming PLCs, you lose them really, really quickly. So we have to find better ways of bridging that gap. So educating the analysts to understand what they're looking at. And OT SOC analysts are hard to find. I was going to say, I think I know two in the world. So yeah, they're very hard to find. From a process perspective though, low communication between OT and security SOC teams, low understanding in the SOC to OT incidents business impact. So, you know, if a SOC analyst receives an alert that says, hey, this controller has stopped responding, what does that mean to them? Like, do they know what the impact of that controller not responding actually is? These basically threat modeling needs to be worked out together. They need to understand what the impact is when devices go offline or when programs are uploaded. That will help with the processes. As well as clients investigating cyber insurance. They want a need for stronger OT security. We're seeing that all the time right now. And then the lack of the single pane of glass across both IT and OT, and the lack of correlating events between those two networks. Low level of automated security remediation for OT networks, and that makes sense because we haven't really been paying attention to these networks. And there's not, when you use the word automated or security in OT, it gets a little bit scary. So you want to make sure that the automation that's taking place is really freeing up time for the people in the plant and the SOC analysts. So a high effort to integrate OT into SOC.
So yeah, as Kristen mentioned, like we just looked at some of the gaps in the modern SOC, and there are also a lot of challenges that CIO and CISOs are asking, and they're asking questions to us because we go and talk with them, like how can we gain more visibility and better understand the risk within the OT environment? Who should take the ownership of IoT and security within our enterprise? How can we build trust and remove silos between IT and OT teams? What is the best way to train our existing SOC team to respond to IoT and OT alerts? How can we centralize IT and OT monitoring and governance within our SOC? What is zero trust in the context of IoT and OT? So I'll pass it on to Kirsten, and she's going to talk a bit about the challenges that we address for the customer and some solutions.
Thanks so much, Jharana. So we're going to look at IoT, OT asset discovery. We're going to look at risk and vulnerability management. We're going to look at continuous IoT threat monitoring for incident response and threat intelligence, as well as operational efficiency. These are just going to be quick screen grabs that I'll walk you through. And then finally, unified IT, OT security monitoring and governance. And you can just split the slide there, Jharana. So let's take a look at what it looks like to get some assets out of Defender for IoT. So here's what we see passively. You know, we haven't scanned the network. We're really just looking at sniffing the network. We're looking at scan traffic. We can see the IP address. We can see, you know, the last activity, what type of device. This is a PLC, the protocols that are running off that device. We can see the vendor. We can also see the firmware version, which, you know, is really, really critical when we're building out that complete asset database. And you can go to the next one, Jer. Risk and vulnerability management. So kind of like what I said there, we know what the firmware is. We can search via CVE. This is a great kind of example of, you know, SolarWinds, Log4j, when you're looking for specific assets in your environment that are being impacted because the executive are asking you, you know, how many devices do we have that are vulnerable and who's watching these devices from the point until the patch is released. This is really critical as well. Also continuous IoT and OT threat monitoring. So quickly looking at an incident here, we can see in the event timeline at the bottom there, first event that spawned this incident was two devices were detected. We can see on February 2nd that these two devices popped up. And then right away after that, we can see that those two devices started communicating with each other. Interesting. What's more interesting though is in March 9th, so like a month and a few days later, we noticed that there was a login attempt from an SMB client device. So that's interesting. It's even more interesting when that suspicious SMB message is being sent from that device. So we can tell, you know, that had we been paying attention to the new device alerts and said, hey, what are these new assets on the network? Maybe we would have been able to intercept the device from transferring malware across the network in the environment. So really detection is key. Reconnaissance does not happen in a second. Sometimes it can be days, weeks, months, years when attackers are in the environment. So you have to look for clues, changes in the environment. And then operational efficiency. This is more great for, I think, folks in the OT environments, because it gives them a view into their devices on the network, and it's really vendor agnostic. It's looking at all the devices in the network. So it's going to see your Honeywell, it's going to see your Rockwell, it's going to see your Schneider. It doesn't care about the vendor, and it understands the protocol, so it's able to see when, you know, a backnet operation has failed. It knows when PLC operating modes have changed. It knows basically, you know, if a device is suspected to be disconnected. That's a huge one. So being able to get this visibility helps the operational teams understand what's happening in their environment, and a lot of times helps them fix misconfigurations or malfunctioning devices. And then unified IT OT security monitoring. How do we break down these silos, and how do we leverage existing workflows and tools to centralize our IT OT security in SOC? And how do we demonstrate to auditors that we have a safety and security first environment?
And yeah, like we kind of saw like what capabilities can help SOC team to collaborate more efficiently. Like for OT enabled SOC, it can be divided into three parts, like expertise, processes, and technology. Here in expertise, we think it's really important the SOC to know all the things that truly matter in OT in order to triage correctly, communicate better with the OT, and also understand how to continue with the investigation. For instance, crown jewel assets, vulnerabilities, risk assessment, and who is the asset owner. For example, we want every tier 1 analyst to be able to identify any abnormal behavior and triage it correctly based on the expected business impact, and device important, and also contact the right OT engineer. Essentially, we are turning any SOC analyst into a skilled OT analyst backed by the knowledge we are exposing. In processes, we are giving security teams across OT and IT the same tools and workflows that they can use across all the teams and all the use cases. With automating those procedures using solution packages, they get out-of-the-box workbooks, analytical rules, and playbooks to codify their processes and reduce manual work. Finally, in technology, we are bringing that much needed single pane of glass that we will give analysts a more holistic experience across all data sources, like integrating Defender for IoT with Sentinel. And with Sentinel, this set of capabilities is available out of the box with no need to spend hours of SOC engineers. And as we discussed earlier, OT devices can sometimes be only one stopping point in a bigger chain of an attack. With that breadth of signal, several weak signals across the network can turn into one strong one. For IT and OT, this merger is really a game changer.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jharana. So to summarize, we talked about IoT and OT devices and the nature of the networks that these devices live on. We talked about attacks that targeted specifically IoT and specifically OT devices. We showed maturity model. We talked about the CIS steps. Why skip the first control? This is one of my constant complaints. What are we hearing at the C-level, and how do we address their concerns? And what are the gaps in OT and IT and visibility? How can we address that? And honestly, Jharana and I are working with customers daily when it comes to Defender for IoT and Sentinel, and really kind of helping them to enable the OT-enabled SOC. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask us. We've got a ton of hands-on experience, and we'd be happy to answer the questions.